Right, so I'm here with Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy, just to ask an array of strange questions about digital marketing. The first one is, why does most advertising generally suck? I've got my own theory about this, is that most creative people are writing songs, movies, books, so we don't get the top talent within our industry.
I don't think that's the case, actually. I think that, don't forget that the talent in advertising, and particularly in digital advertising, there's some pretty extraordinary people there.
Yeah.
And in the early days of anything, you will always attract talent, partly because people are drawn towards fast-growing fields, quite intelligently.
Yeah.
And fast-growing fields are more interesting, by and large. Particularly if you want to innovate, they're a much better place to be. I think the real problem actually is a different one. Don't forget that the people who are writing poems or film scripts don't have to deal with other people.
Yeah.
There's a very big difference between writing a film script and getting one made.
Yeah.
And there's a very big difference between writing poetry and making a large movie.
Yeah. And
the constraints and compromises you need in order to actually get these things made are fundamentally different. Where I think there's a bigger problem is that, unfortunately, nobody really understands how advertising works.
Yeah.
And the assumption is it's all about messaging and the provision of information or argument or rational persuasion.
Yeah.
The actual truth of the matter is advertising mostly works through the inference of the recipient. What inferences they draw from what you say, not what you yourself say explicitly. And this distinction between proposition and takeout has, I think, overtaken and just become a dominant model in and among the people who judge advertising, the people who commission advertising, and also the people who research advertising to an extent.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, it's all about, does this single-minded message that we have decided on in advance get absorbed and understood by the people who watch it? And the amount of attention paid to that in relation to the emotional effect that the communication has on people, and the effect it has on people's unconscious.
Yeah.
The ratio of attention of those two things is completely out of whack, and that's really the problem.
Yeah, Dave Trott said that we're hit with around 1,000 messages per day, and whenever he asks an audience, how many do you remember, only a few hands go up, and how many do you remember positively, even less, go up.
We remember, in fairness, we remember more than we remember, in defence of ineffective advertising, which may seem a very strange thing to say.
Yeah.
Advertising which is not explicitly remembered still has an effect, because it seems to be that we have an instinct for the familiar. It's occasionally called the sort of mere recognition heuristic, which is things that we have somehow heard about before, even without being aware of hearing about them. Are processed differently in the mind in some respects to things that are entirely unfamiliar. So actually advertising that we don't notice works, it seems. Now that sounds a very strange thing to say. However, what you're absolutely right about is the stuff that achieves real emotional cut-through. The Germans have a wonderful phrase, ein Stop-Effekt, which is two English words treated as if they're German. And the stuff that has stop effect is probably too low a proportion. It can never be everything, by the way. The amount we're exposed to means that, for us to pay the same level of attention to every single advertisement we see that we pay to, a book or whatever, is probably not going to happen, realistically. Equally, I also have a quibble, which is the assumptions about how advertising works has also, particularly offline, destroyed a particular kind of high engagement advertising, which was long copy advertising.
Yeah.
Now, direct mail still uses it, the web still uses lots of copy, anybody who sells on eBay uses a lot of copy, and the effect of that copy may not actually be to message, but to reassure.
Yeah.
In other words, the emotional effect of it is the person who is writing this knows what they're talking about and has put a lot of thought and effort into this communication. The effortfulness of a communication, which might include the degree of creativity, but quite literally the amount of work put into creating it, seems to have some effect on how seriously we take it.
Do you think the advent of social media, and if you create something genuinely innovative, provocative or entertaining, have you seen the Dollar Shave Club?
What is DollarShaveClub.com? Well, for $1 a month we send high-quality razors right to your door. Are the blades any good? No. Our blades are f***ing great.
Yes, fantastic.
That people voluntarily shared that because it was very, very well written, but you could never imagine Gillette putting that on TV because there's various references in there that are a bit too provocative. It seems that when something genuinely great is created, there's an effect where they get much larger reach because of it. Do you think that will change advertising at all? Provocative
that was interesting too, because it was kind of funny in a way that viral videos don't normally attempt to be funny in many respects. You know, it wasn't just just purely zany. You know, it wasn't about skateboarding cats. It was actually genuinely great writing, delivered, of course, and importantly, delivered by the guy who actually runs the company. Which I think is highly significant, not by a spokesman. And so, no, I mean, that raises the bar for everyone. There is obviously, for any market challenger, there is that game theoretic question of what can we do as a challenger brand that the incumbent can't. And that's what they did there. First of all, they had less money. Secondly, they had more creative freedom. And they took both those things and ran with it. The only danger we have to be careful of here is we as creative people always admire those brands with extraordinary freedom to do that. There is a fact which is, it's obviously rational for someone who's an upstart competitor to adopt that, which is gain a large amount of saliency with a small niche of people. The only thing you've got to be careful of is that approach can trap you in a niche. You know, that actually, you know, a niche is, you know, we always think of a niche, and an ecological niche is obviously, in some ways, it's a cosy place to be. It actually is a brilliant strategy for avoiding direct head-to-head competition, but it is nonetheless a constraint as well.
Well, what do you think of companies that you must come up against this, where you have these brand documents that have so many rules? And I'll give you an example. I won't mention the client's name, but I always mention it because I find it hilarious. Where we created a comic strip to introduce a very technical IT service, and they came back to me after it had gone through their brand guidelines and PR guidelines and said, "John, we like the comic strip, but can you remove the humour and make it more realistic?" How often do you have to deal with that kind of brand guidelines that are that strict that it makes it very difficult for you to create good advertising?
One of the things it shows is that, of course, brand guidelines are it's a bit like actually any kind of legislation, which is it's often very, very bad at dealing with the unexpected, just as you know, libel and defamation legislation is very bad at coping with Twitter. And that attempt to codify everything, perfectly understandable, is it's a natural instinct. And there are, by the way, there are brands where in some ways the entire game, where I'm defensive, is there are certain brands where the entire game is consistency. That's what the consumer effectively buys. They buy into the fact that there are no surprises. But on the other hand, you can make the case that attempting to codify something as complex as communication is a dangerous game to play. I think what it also does is explain, this is where Ogilvy talks about the big ideal to a great extent, which is that we need a kind of meta definition. What is this brand for? What role does it fulfill? Why does it do what it does? Is more useful in a way of aligning all your communications than attempting to write legislation for an uncertain future. I think that is an important point. You do need some sort of, start with why, as Simon Sinek says. You do need some sort of, overarching idea of what a brand's for. Before you can really write those guidelines, because those guidelines should be based on the overarching purpose, not so much on sort of the style manual approach.
You do see, I've seen a lot of very good brand guideline documents, but do you ever see some of them where you can tell this, this is of no value at all? It's just fluff. You see there's a lot in fashion and a lot of brands like that. Where
if the ratio of abstract nouns becomes over 40%, you've got a problem. I think that's fair. And particularly if they're kind of meaningless wish list abstract nouns. We only really take seriously information that involves a bit of a mental trade-off. So reassuringly expensive is interesting. We like that because there's a little bit of a trade-off there and we can kind of believe it. Okay, it's expensive but it's worth paying for. That's reassuringly expensive. Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice, which was written by Salman Rushdie when he worked here, bizarrely. That also is honest about what the trade-off is. And we tend to absorb that information, and Robert Cialdini has done work on this, much more contentedly than we pay attention to information that's purely all positive puffery. And yet so many guidelines are written and so many propositions are written as if we must obviously only talk about the good things. That I think there's a psychological disconnect there, because we tend to actually mentally depreciate information which isn't costly to say. And if you want to get into this whole thing, there's a whole area in evolutionary biology. It's Amos Zahavi's costly signalling theory. But generally, we take seriously a piece of communication in proportion to what it costs, not only in money, but in effort. What it costs the sender to actually say it. And therefore, merely meaningless boasting actually has very, very little traction. And yet most propositions are written as though obviously that's all we can possibly do. And so the freedom to allow your corporate Twitter voice to actually engage in a bit of self-deprecation or the occasional negative is actually essential to being taken seriously.
That's it's Warren Buffett always starts his presentations with bad news. Because then everything else you say has more credibility.
I seem to remember one year his annual talk started with basically you would have all been better off if I'd stayed in bed this year. So no, I mean again disarming candour you could call it. Robert Cialdini's talked about the fact that actually one of the almost universal techniques of salesmanship is actually to provide the negative, naughty but nice, on the grounds that if you don't provide the negative, the actual consumer will imagine lots of negatives of their own. So trade-off, pick your own strawberries, we get that. Okay, I do a bit of work, I get cheaper strawberries in return for picking them myself. We're all comfortable with that. It kind of obeys the rules of karma, if you like. Cheap strawberries, that sentence, those two words tend to arouse a bit of suspicion, because it's, hold on, if my strawberries were any good, I'd charge full price for them. These strawberries must be a bit shit in some way I don't fully understand.
I like your example of Ryanair and EasyJet saying all of the services they don't offer, because otherwise you'd think you've got an amateur flying the plane.
That's an interesting thing, which is we always look at marketing as if its job is to justify a premium, a price premium. But another role of marketing is actually decontaminating a low price. Because if Ryanair and particularly EasyJet hadn't made all that noise about, if you think of it, it's very irrational what they were doing. They were basically making a noise in PR saying you don't get a meal, you don't get to check in luggage without paying for it, you don't get a pre-allocated seat, although you do now, admittedly. And they would actually then make all this noise about what you didn't get. Now, what on earth are they doing? Well, the argument is that if you don't do that, if you say we're just as good as British Airways, but we're cheaper, people go, well, you're obviously saving money in some area I don't understand. It basically means you don't bother to service your engines and your pilots are a bit crap. So the vital thing there was to actually provide the negative. And IKEA, of course, is very, very explicit. You have to assemble it yourself. The shopping experience is, has an element of pain and discomfort and inconvenience in it. And that's actually important, because you go, I get it, this furniture can be high quality and inexpensive, because the trade-off I'm making isn't in quality. I'm not making a quality trade-off to achieve that low price. I'm making a kind of hassle trade-off to achieve. And we're all cool with that. To pick your own strawberries is the same thing.
I want to move on to the topic that I completely agree with you on, is that the people with spreadsheets, the financial directors, have so much control over how budget is spent. And when a lot of things, like, in my industry, digital marketing, everyone wants to track all forms of digital marketing, like paid search. Now, paid search is great, because you can convert, you can see exactly what keywords have led to how many conversions, what time of day they convert, but that can't be applied to, say, social media. I know that you've put it as we try and track things in a Newtonian way. I've heard you speak about it quite a lot. Have you had any success with changing?
Okay, here's the way to look at it, which is optimization is good up to a point, but it's vitally important to remember you can over-optimize. And I think there's a whole question, which is things like the shareholder value movement, the whole approach to driving efficiency in organizations, without the slight caveat that if you look at nature, it generally places quite a high premium on efficiency, but it also places quite a high premium on what you might call, well, not even resilience. Nassim Taleb would call it anti-fragility. So we actually have 2 kidneys even though we can only function with 1, etc. Yeah. You know, there's quite a bit of redundancy there in the system. If you look at bees, when a bee comes back and does the waggle dance and explains the direction and distance of a bountiful patch of pollen, most of the bees actually follow that instruction and do what they're told and head off to that patch and gather a bit more pollen. Hugely important bit of social intelligence. But it's vitally important to note that quite a few bees, and it varies depending on where the hive is in relation to the equator and probably species of bee as well, quite a few bees don't. They ignore it and just go off doing their own thing. Now you think this is pretty inefficient. They mathematically modelled it and discovered that without those rogue bees, the hive would actually get trapped in a local maximum and starve to death.
Yeah.
That you do need a degree of inefficiency to cope with the fact that the environment in which you operate is not stable or in equilibrium. So one of the important things, I think Nassim Taleb's suggestion, I think has applications to media as well. His suggestion is what he might call a barbell strategy, which is go to the 2 extremes. So put 80% of your money in stuff that you know works. Optimize that, really, really efficient stuff, where the payback is pretty damn certain. Put 20% of your money in stuff that will probably fail, but where the cost is finite, where failure is quickly knowable, and where the potential upside, as with the rogue bees, their chance of failure on their mission is much higher than for the other bees, but actually it's those bees who also discover a massive new pollen patch that's just sprung up somewhere to the northeast. Okay? And so that mixture, understanding risk properly and understanding how to actually respond to it, is better than understanding efficiency. Because anybody who's in a job for 2 years is just going to pursue efficiency.
Yeah, and it actually leads on to the question I was going to ask.
And the danger, because you can say, look what I did, I got it from X to X point. Now, really smart people are realising that in complex systems there's more going on than this. Nature, for example, seems to have checks and balances to prevent over-optimisation. And that you need a degree of experimentation. And so the best software, actually, the best algorithms now are kind of Darwinian. Which is they put a large amount of the money where you'd expect it, where logic would tell you to put it, based on experience, but they continue to actually test the hypothesis. So they will continue to place, albeit a smaller amount of investment, in places where ads didn't work in the past, to keep a little weather eye on the fact that maybe the situation's just changed. Because neoclassical economics has this idea of stable equilibrium where all things return to this equilibrium state. Whereas it's absolutely obvious that both in nature and in business, the marketplace is changing all the time. And you're not in control of it, okay? I mean, one of the things that's widely known in marketing is a brand can just be depositioned. In that the shape of the market changes, so someone who was previously a number 2 becomes a number 3, or falls out of consideration, RIM, you might say. I think it can revive itself cleverly, but that's another matter. But there are cases where nothing you do, may be able to help, that what your competitors do just so ends up creating a choice architecture in which you're a massive loser. And the problem is that if you purely optimise your own stuff and don't pay attention to changing environments and so forth, you can just end up wrong-footed. And so really good software is engaged in continual learning processes where it will go, well, that didn't work last year, but I'll put a tiny percentage of my budget continually seeing whether, because shit happens, stuff changes. The kind of people who buy your brand may change quite a bit.
But one of the things that we're doing that I believe we do very well, it's quite new, especially for online clients, is what you call the branded utility. I call it content stunts or big content, where you create something that is genuinely of use or interesting to your customer base. And it has many benefits, so it'll get digital PR coverage in places probably you wouldn't get coverage normally. Those links help you rank higher in Google. And also the added benefit of people, it's very easy to sneer at advertising, especially online anonymously. It's very difficult to sneer at something that you've created in a useful calculator or infographic. But proving that to a client that that you're improving positive sentiment towards your brand, how people think about your brand when they go to make a purchase, that's a very hard thing to track and to prove. But I don't think it's a non-important variable.
Well, I think the answer is that I always have an instinct to look for branded utility before I look for branded entertainment. And the reason is that, first of all, brands, by existing in the real world, have an opportunity to be useful in ways that is relevant to what the brand itself offers.
Yeah.
If you're not careful with branded content, you end up doing that strange thing. You remember that craze just before the internet? You probably don't remember it, actually. In the early 90s, there was a massive craze for every single organisation producing its own company magazine.
Yeah.
And so you get these strange things from, it was then called Cellnet. I got a magazine from Cellnet because I had a mobile phone, where Cellnet was telling me how to grow my own herb garden. Yeah. I remember thinking, that's slightly outside your remit, mates. You know, if you're telling me how to use a mobile phone, yeah, I'd buy that. You know, but herb gardening, no, I think I'll go.
It has to be relevant.
But secondly, you know, brands can actually. I also think the way in which we use mobile devices. Yes, of course, we all sit on planes and we watch Hollywood blockbusters. What we forget about Hollywood blockbusters is, first of all, the failure rate is enormous.
Yeah.
Okay. Secondly, it is spectacularly unpredictable.
Yeah.
The idea that you can produce content, the way Hollywood business model works is you fail lots of times and your blockbusters pay for the rest. It's like the drugs industry, it's like the pharmaceutical industry. You know, everything fails. Now, just to give you an idea of how uncertain it is and how nobody knows in film, okay, two lovely stories. My brother-in-law met someone who was actually on the set of Star Wars. Now, you look back on that, you know, one of the great films, well, you know, one of the sort of 10 or 15 greatest films of the last 50 years, probably. You know, we obviously said, well, obviously it was going to succeed. So, you know, everybody on the set thought, you know, this is just mad. I'm just here for the money. I'm just indulging George Lucas's delusional fantasies. And they were sitting there reading the call sheets or the scripts, you know, while George wasn't listening, basically taking the piss, going, look at this, C-3PO and R2-D2 are walking across desert sand dunes, R2-D2 is beeping chirpily. What sort of shit is this guy on? And they genuinely thought it was, you know, the people all making the film just thought this is just completely bonkers. When Avatar came out, the studio, which I think was probably Fox, but I may be wrong, but the studio that made Avatar was so uncertain and was so convinced that Avatar may bomb, that in order to ensure their continued survival, they needed a surefire hit. For the moment where if Avatar failed, they'd at least recoup some money somewhere else, which is why they timed Alvin and the Chipmunks, the Squeakquel, okay, which was their backup plan for the failure of Avatar. No one knows shit. I mean, that thing that nobody knows anything is basically true, okay? And the problem with content is utility is a lot more predictable, and our clients often want predictability. Secondly, if you look at the way, particularly on mobile devices, we do a lot of snacking, which is, broadly speaking, it's content as a solution to a job that needs to be done. And if you can actually fulfill that job, first of all, you can be used repeatedly, whereas great content, I can only think of about 15 or 20 films of all the films I've ever seen that I enjoy watching more than once. So think about those films where, okay, you come home and it's on TV and you've got a pitch the next morning and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and you still watch it through to the end even though you've got the DVD.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, okay, I listened. Okay, Goodfellas. You know. Okay, Casablanca, The Third Man. What else? Funny enough, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Weirdly,
fantastic film. He's a hero of mine.
Yeah. John Hughes was an advertising man before he went into filmmaking. He invented, actually, while he worked in advertising, he invented for, I think, Gillette, the credit card test, which was whether your razor was doing a good job, you dragged a credit card along your chin, and if it made a kind of, you know, rough noise, then you hadn't got a good enough razor. Yeah. That was John Hughes before he decided to squander his talent making films. And I'm just trying to think. Okay, Deliverance. Okay, but there are only about 20 of these bloody things. I don't even like watching Citizen Kane. What you can do is repeated utility is a lot easier than repeated. But the interesting thing is, so I think we definitely should look here, and of course it's also, as you said, it's a brilliant foil to those, you know, or brilliant shield to people who complain about advertising. Well, look, here is something which would be good for the consumer, but is difficult to monetize. We will get the brand to do it, and we'll gain a little bit of kudos. I mean, that's exactly what sponsorship is in its origins. That's why Roman emperors paid for naval engagement. It's a perfectly reasonable way in which you actually buy yourself a degree of appreciation.
And actually, journalists and bloggers like this branded utility because it's an easy news story for them. If you make something that's visually appealing, immediately you've got a whole realm of tech publications that will speak about you. So there's a benefit there as well.
I also think people are weirdly bad at it. Like, I'm a huge devotee of taxi apps and a huge devotee of parking apps. Okay, I don't know if anybody's done these things where you park your car and you just put in the 4-digit number, choose the time and hit go. The credit card's debited, and the great thing is then you can actually, if you're a mile away from your car, you can then extend the parking without going back to your car and putting a new little sticky in the windscreen. So it's quite good. Quite often I turn up in a car park and they say, "How long do you want to park for?" Well, I don't know. Do I? I've only just arrived. Anything could happen. So those things, I mean, actually are also interesting because unlike content, which we tend to consume, once and then forget, those actually are weirdly become more and more useful in some ways. You see what I mean? They're one of those things which is, they're what I'd call, it's a bit like one of those things like, having Sky TV or a card or whatever. Once you've done it, you can't do without it. They're actually more closer to addiction, whereas content is more, the problem to be solved is I am bored, show me something new.
I take more cabs now because of Halo and sometimes Uber than I am.
I'd
like to ask you a question actually, because the rise of apps like that, and Halo's probably my favourite app as far as being useful and me being lazy. You made statements that say that the next revolution will not be technological, it will be psychological. Yet apps like Uber and Halo, and there are others, surely that's a technological...
Well, no. In a sense, the technology was pre-existing for 5 years before Halo existed. Okay? Probably there were other factors. Two things. One, not enough black cab drivers had smartphones in the early days, so that the second part of the thing might not work. The second thing might have been... second problem might have been that the threat of Addison Lee was partly what galvanised London cabbies into accepting it. Thirdly, Halo was actually created partly by 3 cab drivers, which meant the degree of acceptance and their degree of the understanding of the details of being a cabbie were, they were just much better at that than anybody else could be. There's probably a fourth factor which possibly people didn't realise, which is that a relatively small number of people take a remarkably high number of all cabs. So that actually, if you can create a habit among that small group of heavy cab users, you've won a surprising amount of business with a surprisingly small number of people. But the actual technology existed. I think what we didn't understand well enough is that psychological thing of why we hate ringing for taxis is the uncertainty. That you ring for one and then you go, well, where is he? Why hasn't he arrived? Maybe he's got the wrong address. Let's go and stand out in the rain to check he isn't there. Whereas in Halo, you just pop your phone on the pub table and you go. So you go, actually, Addison Lee has a perfectly good app that does the same thing as well. So there's also Get Taxi, Uber is of course another one. But what you then do is you watch on the map as the thing approaches. Now that's a completely different emotional thing. You go, oh look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. Oh, I'll go and get myself another pint. But the fact that actually what we really hate is being in a state of uncertainty is a psychological insight. Now, it's a hugely important insight for technologists because technology can now solve this problem. Dot matrix display boards on the tube. I would argue, I mean, Amazon's doing some interesting work. I've got a little cottage in, a little flat in Deal in Kent. And what's quite good is if you order an Amazon parcel there, you can actually watch the parcel approaching. And it will say, Bobby, who's the guy who does the Amazon DPD deliveries in Deal, right? It will say, Bobby is now, you are delivery number, 27 of 64. Bobby is now making delivery number 23. So you nip out of the cafe, go back to your house, I actually did this. 10 seconds before I got back to the house, Bobby turns up, sign for parcel, sling it through the door. Actually, funnily enough, what I had to do... I actually did this. 10 seconds before I got back to the house, Bobby turns up, sign for parcel, sling it through the door. Actually, funnily enough, what I had to do was I had to open my own door, because obviously you can't just hand a parcel to someone on the street. I had to just open the door to give evidence that I actually lived there, sign for it, close the door again, and go... Now, that sort of stuff is really, really interesting. Choice architecture, I mean, one of our discussions is talking to, say, fast food companies and drinks companies about the extraordinary effect that choice architecture... Now, part of that is we like the feeling that comes from the certainty that we've made a good choice. And if the range is messy, or the choice is presented in a way that's befuddling, okay, we experience feelings of discomfiture, which we don't experience if choice is designed in a good... I mean, you all know this, Chinese restaurants, you always feel you should have ordered something else, because the menus are too big. I mean, what a lot of people do is they order... Apparently, among the Chinese community, the set menu is regarded as the idiot guilo option. You know, this is for the fool who can't make up his mind. But you know, we often order the set menu in a Chinese restaurant just to remove the sheer mental befuddlement that comes from looking at 190... Also, I would argue that the huge list of different dishes in a Chinese restaurant actually causes us to infer that the food quality is worse than it is. Because we go, you can't make all this shit that well. You know, come on. You know, are you really saying you've got fresh abalone that you keep just on the 1 in 100 chance that someone actually orders abalone with black bean sauce and whatever it is? The design of choice and how we actually frame it has, you know, I think there's a huge amount of economic value being destroyed by presenting good products in a bad context.
I liked your comment, by the way, on getting more people to buy BP Premium with BT launch. BP Premium
Super Premium. Yep,
like
there needs to be a super premium fuel. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Actually, ask you about the quarterly report, stock report, and people not being as loyal in jobs anymore, other than my staff, obviously. Is that problematic when you want to do a sustained, say, content campaign where you're creating good branded utility, useless stuff on a regular basis, but the big results from that take a long time to be seen, and you're contacting an agent at a client, they have bosses that are putting pressure on them, so it's hard to do long-term campaigns like that because of the short-term pressures.
Well, the thing that terrifies me is the staple of TV advertising. It was never actually, I mean, you know, these are the ones we remember. The staple of TV advertising from the 1970s and 80s was the long-running campaign.
Yeah.
Now, if you're asked to think of instances of a long-running campaign in the UK, you have to struggle a bit. Okay, a few retailers do it. Okay, the grossing multiples, a couple of them do it, just about. Okay, BT just about does it. The insurance, I guess the Meerkat is another example. You know, Giovanni Compario, I guess, is reasonably long running, but there's not much of it.
Yeah.
If I ask you for a long running beer campaign, you're going to struggle.
Yeah.
Now that's partly because where ad spend resides now is different to where it resided. I mean, beer and FMCG packaged goods went from being about 2/3 of all ad spend to under 1/3 in the space of about 15 to 20 years.
Yeah.
So that's partly the effect of it, and that partly is why we enjoy advertising less than we did, which is the amount of ad spend which is for those what you might call jolly items like crisps and beer and stuff, which is bought out of and cigars, if you like, which was bought out of the fun part of everybody's budget, you know, the discretionary income of people's budget. That stuff tends to be more fun than advertising for stuff which is kind of, you know, something you need, like an energy company or something like that.
Yeah.
I never quite understand the resentment of energy prices, because my argument is, look, it looks like a pretty good deal to be energy. I pay 100 quid a month for energy, I get to live in the 21st century, not the 19th. Yeah, okay, I'll take that deal. Yeah. But because we have no proper mental idea of value. Yeah. You know, I mean, let's face it, your electricity goes off for 2 hours, it's like being lobotomized, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty awful. You know, I don't really grudge the money I pay for electricity in that sense. You know, if you look at it from an economist's viewpoint rather than from, you know, the standard emotional reaction, which is because we have no choice but to pay it, we resent it. Well, that creates a very weird psychological thing, which is the things that are really useful we resent paying for, whereas things that are useless, like a pair of designer sunglasses, 150 quid, because we don't have to buy them, we don't resent paying for them.
Yeah.
Now that creates a very peculiar psychological effect, if you ask me, that we hate paying for things that are really useful, but are really happy paying for twatty things. We're happy paying for really twatty things, like fashion or whatever. Yeah. Oh no, I'm not paying for a bloody electricity bill. No, all that does is keep me warm and entertained. But anyway, sorry, where have I gone? We were talking about, I went off on one there, but there are some fundamental problems, which is that economics doesn't make much. If you look at the quarterly reporting problem, it probably does cause companies, well, not necessarily the companies are responding to analysts, but analysts are obsessed with justifying their decision, and the tools they use to justify their decision disproportionately tend to be financial information, and the financial information is, of course, the rear view mirror.
Yeah.
It is like driving by looking in the rear view mirror to some extent. But if you look at the way that people in companies are often incentivized, but that also creates some problems because it encourages companies to treat people as kind of disposable resource. In other words, there's no bond of loyalty between employer and employee, because employees have cottoned on to the fact that actually if it's expedient to do so, I'm toast. I'm only as good as my last quarter, as it were, which doesn't allow for the spirit of kind of mutual, it's one of the reasons why certain salaries have gone up as well, because people will accept a lower pay in turn for what they see as some sort of, security of tenure. In other words, that your employer's interest in you goes beyond, a time horizon of a week.
Yeah.
And that probably does. Having said that, there's a lot to be gained. There's a lot of arguments for optimising the short-term stuff. In many ways, there's no point in doing a fancy brand campaign until your search engine optimisation is working pretty well.
Yeah.
Because what's the point of advertising something really effectively only to find that when people search for it, they find your competitor?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have to be alert to this, that there is a necessary and healthy focus on the short term, because by and large the way to make a long-term profit is often a series, but that is not absolutely, that is true, but is not the whole truth.
I'm very happy for you to say that search engine optimization should come before the branded campaign, by the way, just for my own selfish gain.
To me, I think you should optimize outwards from the transaction. There seems to be a certain amount of logic in that, and the advertising conversation tends to start a long way from purchase and move in.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how the direct marketing conversation always understood start with a coupon, as it were.
Yeah.
And that does seem to make more sense to me, at some level, that until you've actually, perfected the areas like, the last mile, as you might call it, the on-shelf presence, all that stuff. Until you've perfected that, then don't do any advertising. When you've perfected that stuff, then advertise. Yeah. Because I'm sure there are brilliant ad campaigns that fail, not because they're bad advertising, they're excellent, but because something else in the complex system that is the marketplace, something else is actually dodgy.
I've got a few just light-hearted questions.
Of course.
What are your, if you had to pick a favourite brand or advertising campaign, one or the other, of all time, which would you pick?
At the moment, the Dove, I think the Dove Sketches campaign is probably the one. The reason I was slightly delaying is I don't like to appear self-interested, and it's an Ogilvy campaign. But I admire that immensely. I think that's if you go back historically, the De Beers campaign of how else can a month's salary last a lifetime.
Yeah.
The brilliant sort of anchoring effect in that is genius. But De Beers is probably one of the most extraordinary cases of value creation. But of recent work, the Dove Identikit work is absolutely extraordinary, because I think that does actually create a kind of wow moment, an epiphany.
Yeah.
It's difficult to do. Advertising always tries to do an epiphany. It's not it's not all that easy. But I think that is actually close to an epiphany. And if you look at the emotional, regardless of how beautiful the intellectual argument is, the intellectual argument stacks up. If you look at the emotional reaction to people when watching that, it is extraordinary. I mean, it includes things like tears and all the whole panoply of human emotion is aroused by that. So,
tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Once I get a sketch, say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
This is the sketch that you helped me create, and that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything. It couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah.
I don't know if you don't have to answer this one, but what is the most embarrassing advert you've seen, or just terrible work? Have you seen something so shocking?
I have to say, and I won't be alone in this. I'll be in a lot of company. I don't like doing this, because it's if you can't say anything good about someone, don't say anything at all. Although Dorothy Parker actually said, if you can't say anything good about people, come over here and sit right next to me. but actually, there are pieces of activity. I mean, there's one bank campaign at the moment which just seem, I don't think that just seem to be, to make no sense at all. Where what's driving the activity is fundamentally wrong. But I would argue that a lot of advertising is actually misdirected, because if you look at the people who just do tons of it, right? Which are actually the insurance comparison websites, Money Supermarket, etc. In a way, whether or not you like the work, they understand that actually, first of all, you're advertising to a moving parade, as David Ogilvy says. You need to keep doing it because new people are entering the marketplace all the time. But the second thing is they seem to realise that saliency at some level, really, really counts.
Cool. Well, I guess thank you very much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, John.
I'll no doubt see you soon.